The candles burned down to nothing on Yuki Tamura's wedding night. She'd crossed an ocean to marry a rancher 3 times her age, a man the whole Montana Territory called a monster. For 12 hours she'd braced herself for the cruelest thing a husband could do to a stranger bought through the mail. Then the old man set a small lacquered box on the table, slid it toward her, and walked out of the room without a word. What was inside would prove he'd been carrying her name since before she was born. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. The story didn't begin in that candlelit room. It began 3 months earlier, on a fishing boat nosing through cold swells off the coast of Kyushu, with a young woman holding a creased photograph in one hand and her grandmother's medicine case in the other. Yuki Tamura grew up where the sea took as much as it gave. Her grandmother, Miyako, had been the healer in their village for 40 years, the kind of woman people walked 2 days to see when a fever wouldn't break or a bone set wrong. From the time Yuki could hold a needle, Miyako taught her the old way, the Japanese way of reading a body through touch and treating it with herbs she dried above the kitchen fire. She used moxa that burned slow against the skin, and needles so fine they caught no light at all. That training was the only inheritance Miyako could leave her, and it was what Yuki carried when everything else got taken. Her father had drowned the year before, pulled under a net in water too deep and too cold for the crew to reach him in time. The debt he left behind ate the house, the boat, and the last of the rice stores the family had laid in for winter. By spring there was nothing left to sell except the one thing the village still valued, a daughter trained in hands that could heal. The matchmaker came on a morning when the rain wouldn't stop. He was an akodo, a go-between, the kind of man who traded in photographs and promises, and took his cut from both sides of the bargain. He laid a picture on the table in front of Yuki's mother, a rancher in America, standing in front of a low house with mountains behind him. The picture made the man look gentle, maybe 50. His face hadn't yet been ground down by the weather, and the Nakado swore he was kind, lonely, and rich enough to keep a wife in comfort half a world from the drowning coast. The photograph lied, and so did the one they sent back. Yuki's mother dressed her cousin in Yuki's good kimono and sat her in front of the same wall, and the Nakodo mailed away a picture of a woman who wasn't her. Both bride and groom were being sold a person who didn't exist, and neither of them knew it yet. Yuki understood the bargain anyway. She would go because the debt would swallow her mother and her younger brother if she didn't. The alternative, the Nakodo had hinted at, a merchant in Nagasaki who wanted a second wife and didn't care whether she wanted to be one, was worse. She packed the medicine case, the photograph, and a single pressed white plum blossom her grandmother had kept in a lacquered box since before Yuki was born, and she packed nothing else worth carrying. Her mother didn't cry at the dock. She'd used up her crying the night the boat came back without her husband, and she pressed a folded cloth into Yuki's hand and told her to be useful and to be careful and to send word if she could. Her younger brother stood behind his mother with his fists in his pockets, too young to understand that his sister was being traded for his survival and old enough to feel the wrong of it. Yuki held the cloth the whole way across the harbor and didn't unfold it until the land was gone, and inside was a single coin her mother had been saving since winter, the last thing she had left to give. The crossing took weeks. She spent them learning the few words of English the ship's cook was willing to teach her, and watching the water turn from gray to black to a blue so deep it looked like the sky had fallen in. She told herself she would survive by being useful, not by being loved, and she held the medicine case against her ribs like it was the only part of her old life that could still walk. She didn't know what kind of man sends for a wife he's never seen, what he wanted her for, or whether the kindness in his photograph had ever existed at all. She couldn't say. She only knew that the boat was carrying her toward a man the matchmaker called gentle, and that matchmakers, in her experience, were the last people on earth you should trust. The stage dropped her where the road gave up. Cedar Hollow sat in a basin between 2 ridges in Montana Territory 3 saloons, a general store with a crooked door, and a church whose bell hadn't rung in years. It was the kind of town that existed because someone had been too tired to keep riding and decided the rest of the world could come to him. The driver helped her down and didn't let go of her arm right away. He leaned close, and his breath smelled of tobacco and the road. "You're the Marston woman." He said it like a man sorry to be the one saying it. Then he told her what the whole territory believed about Silas Marston, because he figured she ought to know what she was walking into before she got there. They said he'd buried 2 wives already, one in the ground and one in the river. Neither death had slowed him down. They said he'd driven a trespasser off the cliff above the south pasture 20 years back and slept fine that same night, and his hands were afraid of him, which meant something coming from men who weren't afraid of much. The driver told her, all of it standing in the dust, with the horses still steaming between the traces. The ranch sat an hour out of town, where the creek bent around a stand of cedar and the land opened into a valley that should have been beautiful and wasn't, not in that light. The house was low and solid, built by a man who cared more about what would hold than what would impress anyone. Silas Marston was waiting on the porch when the wagon rolled up, and the first thing she saw was the size of him. He was older than the photograph by 20 years at least, with a face the weather had carved into something hard to read, and his shoulders were enormous. His hands hung still at his sides. He didn't smile or apologize, and he said one word to the driver before he took her bag from the bed of the wagon and turned toward the house. She watched him lift the bag, and then she watched him stop. He'd seen the medicine case, the small lacquered box she'd wrapped in cloth and tied to the top of the load, and he handled it separately from the rest. He set it where it wouldn't shift in the wagon bed without being asked and without saying why. She filed the detail away the way her grandmother had taught her to file away the things a body does that the mouth won't explain. The town had already made up its mind about her before she'd unpacked a single thing. She was the foreign woman, the one who'd come on a boat to marry a monster no local girl would have. A man at the general store muttered a word she didn't recognize, but understood fine from the sound of it. The storekeeper watched the man say it, and said nothing to stop him, and he took her coins and counted back her change to the penny, and never once looked at her face. She understood then that the meanness here wasn't loud, the way it was in the stories she'd heard about lawless towns. It was the quiet kind that lets a man say a slur in a room full of people, and not one of them will meet the woman's eye to apologize for it. 2 children stopped in the street and pointed until their mother pulled them inside. She had walked into a place that had no use for her and no law that would protect her if the man on the porch turned out to be exactly what they said he was. She decided, standing in that yard with the dust settling on her skirts, that she wouldn't beg and she wouldn't break. She would make herself worth keeping alive, and she would find out one way or another what the man who carried her medicine case so carefully was really made of. The marriage happened the next morning in the front room of the ranch house. It took less time than saddling a horse. A preacher came out from town with a book under his arm, and 2 of the hands stood in as witnesses, and neither of them would meet her eyes. Silas signed the paper, she signed the paper, and the preacher read some words that sounded like they'd been said too many times to mean anything anymore. There was no food afterward, and no one to wish her well. When the preacher left and the hands left, she was alone in a house that belonged to a man who had not yet spoken a full sentence to her. Night came down hard on the valley. The cold came with it, the kind that finds the gaps in the walls and sits there, and she heated water on the stove and washed the road off her skin. She braided her hair the way her grandmother had shown her, tight and clean, the way a woman braids it when she's preparing for something she doesn't want undone. She sits on the edge of the bed. The cabin is quiet except for the stove and the wind pressing at the window. She has decided already, somewhere on the boat between the old world and this one, that she won't beg, because whatever he comes in here to do, she won't give him the satisfaction of asking him not to do it. Her grandmother had taught her that there are some things a body survives by holding still for, and some things it survives by refusing to hold still at all. The trick is knowing which is which before the moment is on you. The door opens, and he fills the frame the way he filled the porch, too large for the house and too large for the quiet, and he doesn't come toward the bed. Instead, he crosses to the table in the center of the room. He sets something down on it, a small box, black lacquer, with a gold plum blossom painted on the lid, no bigger than his fist, and he slides it across the wood toward her side of the table. Then he turns and he walks out, and the door closes behind him, and she hears his boots cross the yard toward the bunkhouse where the hands sleep. She doesn't move for a long time. The box sits on the table in the lamplight, and the plum blossom on the lid catches the glow, the way silk catches it, the way something too fine for this country catches it. She knows that box. She has known it since she was a child, since the morning she sat on the floor of her grandmother's kitchen and watched Miyako sort her herbs and tell stories about a time before the drowning coast. She crosses to the table, and her hands are steady because they have to be. She lifts the lid, and inside there are two things. The first is a slip of paper folded once, with her grandmother's name written on it in brushstrokes, the characters of Miyako's name in a hand that isn't her grandmother's, but is older than the paper should allow. The second is a pressed white plum blossom, flat and brittle, the petals thin as skin, the kind of flower that only keeps if someone has kept it for a very long time on purpose. It is the ume, the same blossom stamped into the cloth lining of her own medicine case, the one her grandmother pressed there the year Yuki was born. She holds the dried flower in her palm and feels the weight of the years in it, the decades it must have spent in a box, in a house in a country that has no plum trees like this one. The fear doesn't leave, but it cracks, and it opens into something she has no name for, a question that sits in her chest where the dread used to be. She can't fathom how a rancher in Montana Territory came to carry her grandmother's name in brushstrokes and a flower that should have turned to dust 40 years ago. She doesn't know what he knows that she doesn't, or what he is doing with her here, in this house, in this marriage, if not the thing every woman on that boat had been bracing herself for. She didn't sleep. She sat at the table with the box open in front of her and the blossom in her hand and the lamp burning down, and she waited for morning with a question that wouldn't let her close her eyes. The days after the wedding moved slowly and without explanation. He'd given her a room of her own, a small one off the back of the house with a window that looked out on the cedars, and he put a lock on the inside of the door where her hand could reach it. He asked nothing of her. Food appeared on the counter in the mornings before the hands were up, rice he must have ridden into town to buy, and a small iron stove that sat in the corner of her room and threw heat better than anything in the main house. He didn't explain any of it. She didn't ask, because the asking would have meant trusting the answer. She lived inside that silence for a week. A man who behaved nothing like the monster the territory had described didn't make sense to her, not when he wasn't kind in any way she could name, and wasn't cruel either. He was a wall she couldn't read, and the box on the table was the only crack in it, and he had walked out of the room before she could ask him what it meant. The answer she got wasn't the one she was looking for. It began on a morning when one of the hens, a young man named Eddie, came in from the south pasture with his leg opened up from knee to hip. A steer had gored him against a fence post, and the wound had been left too long in the dirt and the heat. By the time they laid him on the bunkhouse table, the flesh around it had gone the color of something alive that shouldn't be. The nearest doctor was 2 days' ride. Corder, the foreman, quiet man who had worked for Silas longer than most, shook his head when he looked at it. He said they'd lose the boy before any doctor could get there, and he said it the way men say things they've seen before and stop being surprised by. Yuki heard it from the kitchen. She came into the bunkhouse with the medicine case in her hands before she decided to come. The men stepped back, not out of respect, but out of the way a room clears for a woman who looks like she knows what she's about to do. She opened the case on the table beside Eddie's leg, and the small wooden trays slid out one after another. The herbs, the moxa, the fine needles. They were the same tools her grandmother had laid out on a kitchen floor in a village that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Now her hands knew each one. She cleaned the wound with water she boiled on the bunkhouse stove, packed it with herbs she had crushed between two stones, and laid the moxa along the edges where the infection was climbing. The slow burn of it made Eddie's breath catch and then ease. The finest needles went in along the meridian her grandmother had taught her, the ones that pulled the heat out of a swelling body and gave it somewhere to go. She worked for an hour without speaking. The men watched her, and the thing they watched was their own faces changing in a way none of them had expected, because none of them had seen a woman do this kind of work before. Silas stood in the doorway the whole time. He didn't come in or stop her or ask what she was doing or whether she knew how, and he stood with his shoulder against the frame and his arms crossed and watched her hands. His face did something she couldn't read, something that wasn't approval and wasn't surprise and wasn't any of the things she'd learned to look for in a man's face. By morning, the fever had broken. He opened his eyes and asked for water, and Corder let out a breath he'd been holding since the day before. He looked at Yuki across the bunkhouse and called her Ma'am, and it was the first time any man on that ranch had called her anything but the foreigner. Then she saw the shape of what Silas had been doing since before she arrived. The hands had been told her quarters were off limits, every one of them, in a voice that left no room for argument, and he had been shielding her in his blunt and wordless way, the way a man shields something he isn't ready to name. The rice in the kitchen, the stove in her room, the way the worst of the town's talk never seemed to reach her door, it had all been moved out of her path before she'd known it was there. That night she found clean linen folded outside her door. It was the kind for bandaging, with a jar of honey from the ranch kitchen set on top of it, and she hadn't asked for either. Silas had been in the south pasture all day and hadn't come through the house, which meant he'd left them before dawn and hadn't waited to be thanked. She stood in the hallway holding the jar and the linen and felt the shape of a man who gave in the only language he had left, which was the thing left on a step without a word attached to it. She could see the gap now between the reputation and the man. She just couldn't see all the way to the bottom of it, and that box was still the only thing that promised to show her. She waited 3 more days before she brought the box to him, because she needed to be sure she could ask without her voice breaking. Her grandmother had taught her that the right question asked at the wrong time is worse than no question at all. Some questions can't be hurried. She found him on the porch in the evening light. He was mending a bridle with hands that move the way hands move when they've done a thing 10,000 times. He set the lacquered box on the rail between them, and she opened the lid so the paper slip and the dried blossom were visible, and she spoke his name once, and then she waited. He looked at the box for a long time before he looked at her. When he spoke, his voice was lower than she'd heard it, and slower, like the words had been sitting in him for decades and came up heavy. He told her about a winter in the 1,860 seconds. He'd been a young merchant sailor on a ship that put in near Nagasaki for repairs. A fever took him in the port, the kind that kills a man in 3 days when it goes wrong, and his own crew had given him up and were ready to leave him on the docks. A woman from a fishing village up the coast heard there was a foreigner dying. She came down, and she took him back to her house, and she nursed him for a month with the old medicine, the herbs and the moxa and the needles, until the fever broke and he could stand again. Her name was Miyako. She refused the money he offered, and she told him he owed her nothing but the living of his life, and she gave him the lacquered box with her name on a slip of paper and a pressed plum blossom inside it. Carry it home. Live in a way that's worth the saving. He carried it for 40 years. A war took half the men he'd shipped with, and a hard territory took 2 wives and a dozen hands, and most of the softness he'd ever had, and still he carried it. A woman he couldn't repay had told him to, and carrying it was the only way he knew to keep the promise. When the Nakado came through with photographs of brides from the coast near Nagasaki, Silas hadn't been looking for a wife, but for a way to answer a debt he'd carried since before any of these people were born. The village was the right one. The name was the right one, too. He asked enough questions to learn that there was a granddaughter, a girl trained in the same hands, and that the family had fallen into debt, and the girl was being pushed toward a match in Nagasaki with a merchant who had a reputation for breaking the women he bought. He didn't send for a wife. He pulled her out of the path of a worse life the way her grandmother had pulled him out of a fever, and the marriage was the only honest way the law of this country would let him do it. He could give her a roof and keep the world off her back without owning her because she wasn't his to own. She was a debt he'd been waiting 40 years to pay. He hadn't touched her because she wasn't his to take. He'd given her the box so she'd know, before she spent one more night afraid of him, that the man she'd been sold to had been saved by the woman who'd raised her. Yuki didn't weep. She'd expected to, somewhere in the back of her mind, the way a woman expects to weep when a thing finally makes sense. Instead, she sat down on the step beside him and held the box in her lap and felt the full weight of it settle into her. It was not love, and it was not even trust. Not yet, but a recognition. It was the kind that passes between two people who have both learned what it costs to stand alone against something bigger than them and who see it in each other before they see anything else. The 40 years, and the ocean, and the dead woman's hands, and the living man's silence were all in the weight of it. She stayed on the step until the light went out of the valley, and she didn't say thank you, 'cause the debt didn't want thanks. It wanted something she hadn't figured out yet. The territory didn't care about debts of honor. The trouble that had been circling the Marston place for years chose that winter to close in. His name was Hollis Vance, and he ran the biggest spread in the basin. He owned the land to the south and the land to the west, and more than that, he owned the only reliable spring that fed the lower pastures, the water that every ranch in the basin depended on through the dry months. He kept the sheriff in his pocket the way a man keeps a coin, and he'd spent the better part of a decade trying to swallow the Marston place the way he'd swallowed the 2 ranches beside it. Hollis heard about the foreign wife before the snow was off the ridges. He read it the way a man like him reads everything, as weakness, an old rancher with no son, a crew that got thinner every season, land he could no longer work alone, and now a wife from across the ocean who couldn't even speak the language. He saw a man coming apart at the edges, and he moved in to finish it. It started small and mean. Hollis pushed his cattle onto the Marston pasture and left them there, and he dammed the creek where it crossed onto the lower field and took the water for his own herd. His men rode the fence line at night, and in the mornings Silas's hands found the wire cut and the posts leaning, and there was never anyone to point to because Hollis's men were gone by daylight. Then the storm came, and the survival counter hit all at once. A fence section gave way in the dark and the cold, and 40 head scattered into a ravine that the snow had hidden. A hand named Pete came back with his leg broken in 2 places, and a gash across his ribs where he'd been dragged against the wire. The herd was half gone by morning, the fence was down across a 1/4 mile of the south line, and the ranch that had been holding on by its teeth all winter nearly broke in a single night. Yuki worked through the dark. She set Pete's leg with a splint she cut from a fence post and wrapped with the last of the clean cloth, and she stitched the gash closed with the curved needle her grandmother had used for the worst wounds. She did it by lamplight, while the wind took the rest of the herd, and there was nothing any of them could do about it. Her hands didn't shake because they couldn't afford to, and when she tied off the last stitch, the storm was still screaming, and Pete was still breathing, and that was all that mattered until the sun came up. When the light came, Silas rode out to count what was left, and came back with his jaw set and nothing in his eyes. He'd lost 18 head to the ravine, a mile of fence, and most of a season's calf crop, and he didn't curse or shout, because the men who do that in a hard country are the ones who break first. He just stood in the yard looking at the broken fence. The mud and the sky clearing over the ridge were all that was left to look at, and Yuki watched him from the porch and understood that this was the real man under the reputation. Not a monster, but a man who had been losing things his whole life and had taught himself not to flinch when the next one went. The stakes were not just land, not for either of them. For Silas, the ranch was the only thing he had left to offer her, the only proof that 40 years of hard living had added up to something worth protecting. For Yuki, it was the first place since her grandmother's village where her hands had been allowed to mean something, where the thing she'd been trained to do was wanted instead of mocked. Losing it would mean losing the only ground either of them had left to stand on. Hollis sent the sheriff up the road a week later. The man carried an offer that wasn't an offer. Sell to him by spring, or he'd take the water and starve them out before the summer grass came in. The sheriff delivered it, leaning against the porch rail, like he was doing them a favor. And Silas filled the doorway and offered nothing back, and the silence was the kind that means a man has already made up his mind. They weren't going to sell, that was the end of any talking about it, because Hollis, it turned out, wasn't going to wait for the spring grass to come in before he made his move. Hollis came with 14 men and torches before the creek had finished thawing. They rode in before dawn to drive the herd and put the outbuildings to the fire, and they figured an old man, a handful of hands, and a foreign woman wouldn't give them much of a fight. Silas was waiting. He'd known it was coming the way a man who has lived 40 years in a hard country knows when a thing is about to break. Corder and the 3 hands who'd stayed through the winter stood with him behind the ranch house wall, and Yuki stood with them, and there was no plan that added up to anything but the math of how many bullets they had and how few men they were. Silas was old, outnumbered, and not going to run. The woman standing behind him had crossed an ocean to be here, and he had crossed 40 years to bring her, and neither of them had come this far to give the ground back. The turn didn't come from a gun. Yuki saw it before any of them did, because Hollis had brought his son with him, a boy of 12 or 13, slumped in the saddle ahead of one of the riders. Even across the yard, she could see the way he listed to one side, and the heat in his face. She'd seen that face on her grandmother's table, and it was a wound gone bad. The kind that killed a boy in 2 days when a man was too proud or too busy to notice it was killing him. She set her medicine case on the porch rail and walked out into the yard with nothing in her hands, and the men on both sides went still. Her voice didn't rise. She called across to Hollis that his boy was sick, that she could see the infection from where she stood, and that she would treat him right here in the open if he let the boy down off that horse. Hollis couldn't refuse her in front of every man he'd brought to burn a ranch. He couldn't be the man who let his own son die to keep a feud going, not with 14 witnesses sitting their horses around him. He sat there a long moment with his jaw working before he nodded, and they lifted the boy down and carried him to the porch. She treated him on the boards in front of both lines. She cleaned the wound the same way she'd cleaned Eddie's, and she laid the moxa and set the needles. She worked the way her grandmother had taught her to work when the whole room was watching, and the only thing that mattered was the body under your hands. The men who'd ridden in to burn her home stood with their rifles and watched a woman they'd called foreign save a child their boss had been losing. By morning the boy's fever broke. He sat up and asked for water, and the sound of it carried across the yard where both sides had spent the night, not sleeping and not shooting. Then the town came. They came 1 and 2 at a time, the general store owner, and the preacher, and the women whose fevers Yuki had broken through the winter, and the men whose cuts she'd stitched when the doctor was too far to ride. They came up the road and stood on the Marston line. Not one of them had a gun that mattered. They stood there because she'd kept them, or their wives, or their children alive through the cold months, and they'd decided that mattered more than what Hollis Vance thought he owned. Hollis was beaten, but not by rifles. He was beaten by the shame of his own people, by a kindness he couldn't answer with force, by a woman who'd walked into his yard unarmed and taken the fight out of him without raising her voice. He rode out with his men behind him and the boy riding in front of him, and the road stayed empty after that. At the peak of it, a rifle came up on the far line. The air went tight, and Silas stepped between Yuki and the barrel and said 3 words she'd never heard him say. "That's my wife." He said it like he finally meant it. This time, it wasn't a lie bought through the mail, and it was the first true thing either of them had said about what they were to each other. Spring came to Cedar Hollow the way it comes to a place that has earned it. Slow, and then all at once, the snow pulled back off the ridges, and the creek ran clear, and the grass came up in the lower pasture where the water had been stolen and then returned. People rode in from across the basin to see the woman at the Marston place, the one with the small lacquered case and the needles that caught no light. They came with their wounds and their fevers and their children, and she saw them all. She and Silas lived in the same house through the thaw and into the warm months, and they were still careful with each other, and they were still mostly quiet, but the silence had changed. It wasn't a wall anymore. It was the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst possible outcome and finding out the worst wasn't what you'd thought it was. The turn wasn't a speech. Her grandmother had taught her that the things that matter don't announce themselves, and one evening she picked up her things from the room that had been hers and carried them into his room. She set them down without a word about it, and he didn't say anything about it either. He just crossed to the shelf above the bed and cleared a space, and he set her medicine case beside the lacquered box, and the 2 objects from the same grandmother's hands sat next to each other for the first time in 40 years. It was not love, not yet. It was not trust either, or not the easy kind, but a recognition all the same, the kind that forms between 2 people who have both been alone against something bigger than them and who finally see each other clear. The marriage that had started as a debt became a choice, and it became a choice because she made it freely, on an evening with no one watching, which is the only way a choice like that counts. She hadn't chosen to come here, and she knew it. She couldn't fully untangle the gratitude from the feeling, and she didn't try to, and she didn't pretend she could. A choice made after the worst roads had been closed off is still a choice, but it carries the weight of the roads not taken, and she carried that weight with her into the room they now shared, and she didn't set it down. Outside the cabin window, a plum cutting she'd pressed into the ground had taken root. It was growing in Montana dirt that had no business growing such a thing, and it had taken hold anyway. The pressed blossom had finally been replaced by a living one. Pale and small and stubborn, it was growing in foreign soil because someone had bothered to plant it, 40 years after the original was pressed into a box. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels, and hit that like button if it moved you.